Then There's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. March is Women's History Month, a dedicated time of the year to reflect on the still too often overlooked contributions of women to the history of our state and country, and I dare say the world, to which is why we also celebrate International Women's Day in the early part of the month. And I guess you could say that the month of March is most befitting for Women's History Month, as the word march itself implies marching. Steadily moving forward with determination and solidarity, with the purpose of protesting, supporting an effort that demands recognition or brings about change and improvement in people's lives. Women's History Month is a time for action, but equally important, it is a time for reflection and appreciation for the women over the centuries and generations whose contributions and life stories and chronicles of their human condition have traditionally been given only a cursory acknowledgement or ignored altogether or thwarted by men and erased and greeted with indifference by those who call themselves historians, usually men. And that's why it is especially appropriate and timely that the theme of Women's History Month in 2023 is celebrating women who tell our stories. As women started shattering the glass ceiling over the generations, they began to insist on ownership of their own stories, chronicling the world's evolution through a unique and nuanced and non-male lens, and simultaneously challenging the myths and misunderstandings of the past and bringing clarity to their place and impact and contributions in the world by being mentors to the young women who stand on their shoulders. And on this edition of Then There's California, we'll commemorate Women's History Month 2023 by hearing and sharing the stories of two women leaders here at the Capitol, two women of color, one continuing her extraordinary career as a public servant, ensuring that education, access to financial equity, working moms and families are a priority to all Californians, and the other, a recent college graduate, taking notes on all of this Capitol experience, learning about public policy and leadership in real time, both of them reflecting on past journeys and sharing the resolve and tenacity that it has taken for them to be able to seize these narratives and that are bearing fruit for their present lives and careers, and even for the future of the state. It is always a pleasure to have back with us State Senator Monique Limón, who represents the 19th Senate District on California's South Coast, encompassing all of Santa Barbara County and a good portion of Ventura County. And as the 2023 legislative session begins, Senator Limón is the new chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus and continues her service as chair of the Senate Banking and Finance Committee. Senator Limón is also the author of last year's groundbreaking SB 1162, the pay transparency measure, requiring employers with 15 or more employees to include salary ranges on all job postings in order to help narrow the gender and race wage gap. Senator Limón, good to have you back again.
Thank you. It's great to be here again a year later with a whole lot of things that have happened in our state since we last chatted.
And it is a privilege to have joining her Isabella Martinez. Isabella hails from the high desert town of Hemet in Southern California, is a 2022 graduate cum laude of UC Riverside, where she received her bachelor's degree in business administration with a concentration in management. And last fall, Isabella was selected for the Distinguished State Senate Fellowship and is serving her fellowship term in the office of, guess who? Senator Limón. Isabella, it is good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure, Brian. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to have a conversation with Senator Limón, specifically because the Senate Fellowship is really an integral part of the legislature and really how most staff members have had the opportunity to become public servants in the building. And just for a little bit of context, what the Senate Fellowship is, it's an 11 to 12-month program, not only where you get to work in the Assembly or the Senate, but you also can work in the executive and judicial program. You also can take graduate level coursework at Sacramento State, and it's been tremendous so far, and I'm really grateful that I've been able to work with such an extraordinary member, especially at such a critical time for Women's History Month.
So it sounds like this is a partnership for the ages here, Senator
Limón. It is, Brian, and it's super exciting that our California legislature has this program in both houses and the executive branch. I think it's a really amazing opportunity, not just for our individual offices to have the voice of fellows, but also for what it means to have the voices from so many diverse backgrounds backgrounds that may or may not have previous experience working in this building bring an added perspective to the policy. And I think you see that with Isabella, and I have been really honored that this is my third year having a Senate fellow in our office. And it's an incredible opportunity because you just get to hear, you get to see the voice of those that are looking at the work that the legislature does through kind of a fresh new lens, but also a lens that's very committed to serving the people of California.
So it really is not a glorified internship, is it, Isabella?
No,
she
it
puts
is
you
not.
to work.
No, I mean, not work. It's more service than anything, and it's something that I absolutely love doing. So I'm very glad that I'm able to work not only in Sacramento, because this year we're very fortunate that now, past the pandemic, we're the first class to come back in person, but we've had the opportunity to actually see the Capitol building, at least the remnants of what we've seen right now on the floor.
Right. Zoom is more the exception than the rule. So
right. Nevertheless. Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Good. I definitely think that the best way we can celebrate Women's History Month for us as listeners here is for me to step back and let the two ladies who are here representing Women's History Month have a conversation and let the rest of us listen in. But I wanted to open up just with a quick question. We're celebrating Women's History Month, and in the context of that celebration, of course, comes the opportunity to honor women who were business owners and trendsetters and storytellers and barrier breakers. And in our recent conversation with Senator Bradford talking about Black History Month in February, we raised the topic of, it almost sounds glib to ask it, but why only a month? Shouldn't we be celebrating the history and achievement of, in that case, Black Americans every day? Shouldn't Black History Month be a relic by now? So I'll copy and paste that question to you, ladies. Should, in the context of Women's History Month, the acknowledgement that you all bear the responsibility as women of keeping society running and the economy running, no pressure, shouldn't Women's History Month be a relic by now too?
I absolutely believe that Women's History Month should be a moment to reflect not just on the contributions of women for that month, but really if we celebrated, acknowledged, respected, advanced, promoted, uplifted the work that women do every single day of the year, you would see some policy issues not disappear. And certainly as someone that's worked on a lot of policy issues like pay transparency, like childcare, really tackling some health issues that most impact women, I think of the fact of what would it look like if every single day we had in our minds the presence of how important the contributions of women are in our state, in our local communities, in this country, and across the globe. So my answer to that is every day should be a day to reflect on that. And our ability to reflect on that also doesn't mean that you then not reflect on other communities, right? That's also really important. I think sometimes that people don't always put it in the same kind of congruent perspective of like, look, there is room to reflect on all the contributions of everybody. But certainly I know that as we kick off Women's History Month, we want this to be a month of reflection, of creating a space to advance a lot of the work, the previous work of so many women, but also to recommit to wanting to ensure that the voices, the history, the work, the past of women is not lost.
And Isabella, as you come of age here and start in your career, do you think it should have been a relic by now, or do you concur with the senator?
I think that it's really critical that for Women's History Month, not only, as the senator had mentioned, that we take the opportunity to reflect, but I think this new generation, like myself, we're optimistic about the future in terms of having those open dialogues. I think long before, there weren't as many conversations that were brought forth. There was a lot of fighting for those conversations. But nevertheless, as we've moved forward, I feel like we'll have more of that opportunity to have an open forum and provide those perspectives. And Women's History Month is critical, but like you indicated, Women's History Month should not just be the only time that we've had those conversations. And so whether it's in the workplace, in government, or in other respects, we should have more women that are in those spaces to be able to provide those contexts and saying, we've had these conversations, now what do we do about it moving forward?
I want to step back, and you can have a Women's History Month conversation, a conversation between, as I said, two powerhouse ladies here in the legislature, and the perspectives that you want to share with us from the Women's History Month lens, but also the lens that you have as an elected official and a Senate fellow, but both Californians as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Senator, I just wanted to ask you, how is the new legislative year treating you? How is your new role as the Senate Dem Caucus Chair? Are you excited? What are some of the priorities that you're looking forward to this year?
Well, I think that the new legislative year has been a year that is already off to a very busy start. We started the year in California with a lot of natural disasters. There were some very heavy storms in our state in early January, and I think that had a big impact on the work that had to do, because the second we came in, I mean, some people think that the start of a 2-year session, right, is sometimes the quietest time. And so we didn't have that. We're also facing a very different budget year, where our projected budget deficit is certainly very different than the economic situation that our state faced last year. And additionally, you have already a number of policy ideas that are resonating and rising to the top and have so many people across California talking. So I think that combined kind of feel has made this year a very, very busy start year. And so certainly in my own role, and I think about, following Senator Connie Leyva, her footsteps in being the caucus chair, it's been an important and really a great responsibility and an honor to be able to serve in that capacity and be appointed by our pro tem to lead our caucus in that way. And so I'm getting adjusted to that role. I continue in my role as chair of Senate Banking, and all of those things combined with the policy work we do with the everyday constituent issues have made it for a pretty busy year in 2023.
Yeah, I can imagine. I would love to ask you, for you, what does it mean to work not only as a public servant, but working with an all-female staff? This is a new exciting year, as you had indicated, but can you talk a little bit about what that perspective is like as a member working with all-female staff?
Well, one of the things that has happened is that the Capitol office is all female, right? The district office I have, it's definitely very diverse. And without really knowing, we have found that we now have an all-female Capitol office. It does look like that's going to change. But, it's notable because we noticed. There are some offices that don't notice, really, like who is in or is out of the office. And for so many years, this Capitol was all men. I mean, the fact that I know that I am the 151st woman to be elected to the California State Legislature is telling. If you ask my male colleagues where they are at in the placement, they won't know. And I think our numbers continue to be, they're not very high. I mean, this is the history of California. I know that I'm the 151st. And so there has definitely been a lot of intention in wanting to ensure that both the Capitol office, the district office is very diverse, that it reflects California. And little did we know that we had an all-female staff until we stopped and said, oh my gosh, we need a man to work in our office. And so that's going to definitely, again, it's changing, but I think it's also an important place because historically, an office like ours did not exist.
And what do you envision that the legislature will look like in the next few years? I mean, we've had such historical moments with the new freshman class. What do you hope that California will look like, especially in the legislature in the next few years?
Well, I think that already in the 2022 election and looking at 2023, we've seen quite a shift in the demographics of our California state legislature. We went from having 38 women in the California state legislature to having 50 women. So we are closer to parity than we've ever been in this state. There are other states like Nevada, for example, that got to 50% before us, before in the state. And I think that this really speaks to where the electorate is putting their confidence, who the electorate is voting in. We as legislators may say we want more diversity. We want our representation to reflect what the communities look like. And I say diversity, not just in the form of race and gender and ethnicity, but also, of course, geography and wanting to make sure that there's different lived experiences, different ages. And I think that you are seeing now that is definitely changing, but it's changing, I would say, more so because that is where the electorate also wants to see California move. And so for me, that's, I think, really special. We have, more women in the Senate, more women in the Assembly. You see more women chairing committees for the first time. There's still some committees in each house that have never been chaired by a woman. I'm only the second woman to chair Banking and Finance in the California State Senate and the first woman of color to ever chair that committee. So there's still so many firsts that remind us we have a long way to go until we normalize women in leadership.
And in that same vein, I think for many women across the country, progress towards reproductive rights is reminiscent of chutes and ladders in the incessant nature of moving up and down the board with seemingly no end. But on November 8th, California voters passed a historic amendment to the state constitution ensuring that there are explicit protections for reproductive freedom. Can you describe the moment when you heard that voters passed Proposition 1? And what did enshrining abortion rights in the state constitution mean to you?
Well, I think Proposition 1 was really critical, not just for our state, but for our country. And I think that the voters have spoken, just like the voters are the ones that elect members and have elected, more women into office. Proposition 1 is another example of where the voters have spoken in California in terms of what our values are and what's important. And we know that there are more voters who are women, and also there are voters, clearly by the outcome of the election, that there are also voters who, whether they identify as women or not, are very supportive of a woman's right to make a medical decision about abortion, about reproductive health. And so I think that that's really what you see. And when I think about there's been so many moments in this journey. The moment of one believing that the U.S. Supreme Court was not going to undo Roe v. Wade, but there's the moments of also watching other states and perhaps non-traditional states pass or limit some of the propositions that would have inherently cut these rights. And so all of those things have been part of this kind of long trajectory of different feelings about what it means to be a woman in this country, what values we move forward, and how we respect women and their ability to make choices about reproductive health. So I think that there's a lot to be said there, but I went in believing that that's where the voters would be. And I came out of that process doubling down on, look at the numbers. Clearly, California voters were there. And so I guess, my question to you is, how do you feel? You are someone who's had a chance to vote a couple times, and thinking about what this means for your generation of women that are coming up and that are thinking about what this means for your own thinking, your own reproductive health. How did you feel?
I definitely felt like, at least when we had the national conversation, it was very overwhelming at first, because I think we initially had anticipated that this wasn't going to go the other way. But nevertheless, I think when we look back at history, and just as we're doing here in Women's History Month, you've seen that there's specific strategies to unravel some of the work that women before us have done. And so I think that in many ways, this is almost a moment to be able to look at what we're doing right now. And it's been very amazing to see that Californians are putting their foot down across the nation and stating that we are here to enshrine those specific rights. And so I'm very optimistic that as a state, and specifically as a legislature, that we can continue to do that moving forward. But nevertheless, there is so much work that needs to be done, not only in the specific conversations that we have about reproductive rights, but what we're going to be doing in terms of policies and some of the frameworks that we currently have in those conversations. And so I think in many respects, I'm optimistic in some senses, but I'm also cautious. I'm cautiously optimistic about the future and maybe what those dialogues will be. But we're currently the first, at least in many respects, we're one of the few states that at least put our foot down in that respect. And so moving on, I would love to know, at least when I applied for the office during the fellowship, and as a graduate of the college leadership program, I was so ecstatic that you had applied and participated in the HOPE, or the Hispanas Organized for Political Equality program, specifically their binational fellowship. Can you talk to us about your involvement as an elected official and how the fellowship influenced you?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think has been part of the elements that I've believed are important to include in kind of the work we do in terms of public service is think about just the different experiences that kind of shape the perspective you have and what you bring into the office. And so I think some of my belief around fellowships and extracurricular opportunities probably comes from my 14 years in higher ed and always encouraging the many students that I work with, apply for that program, apply for that internship, apply for that fellowship, make sure you do these summer camps or summer programs, whatever they were. And so I think I brought a lot of that into the legislature with me. And I believe it for the team that I work with. I absolutely am always very supportive of the team, finding opportunities that are meaningful, both personally and professionally. And I think to some extent, I do a little bit of that, time permitting. I think that that's one of the really hard things about being in this role, that time doesn't always allow us to do all of the work and have all of the experiences that we would like. So when the Hope opportunity came up, I knew about the Hope program just because so many people that I knew have gone through a different type of Hope program, including a lot of people that work in this building. And they brought forward a really incredible opportunity for me to participate with a binational group between the United States and Mexico, all different walks of life, different parties, to come together to really look at leadership from a global perspective, binational perspective. And so it was an incredible opportunity. We did a little work in DC. We did some work in Mexico City. I met really an incredible cohort of women, including California's Secretary of Housing Development, Lourdes Castro. She was in the cohort as well. And so, I mean, you think about the women and all their lived life experiences, and we were able to really get together to talk about some of these global and international issues that impact women in different policy areas in both Mexico and in the United States. So that's the program I participated in, but I know so many women who participate in a lot of their other programs, right? There's the Hope Institute, Leadership Institute. There's a one-day program, a year-long program. Hope does a lot of work, not just in Los Angeles area or in our state, but really across the country.
And I would love to know specifically, in line with what you were talking about and some of the specific perspectives that you were able to garner from the fellowship, can you talk about how you've used the fellowship experience in your time as a public servant? I think that a lot of the times we get to hear about, as you indicated, some of the things that you got to bring back. But in addition to that, I think I'd love to hear a little bit more about maybe some of your personal background and how it brought you here to the legislature specifically. I think a lot of the times we get to hear about the policies that you've done, as you've indicated, the transparency bill, but we never get to hear outside of the accolades, maybe some of your perspectives and some of the values that you bring. So in line with some of the fellowship experiences that you got and some of the background that you have as an educator, as a mother, and as a Latina, how have you brought that back into the legislature? And what are some of the concerns or at least priorities that you have for the upcoming year?
Yeah, I think like a lot of other legislators, a lot of our lived experiences, life experiences, influence our perspective on policy. And the reason that I think we often push for those diverse perspectives is to create a policy that's not just more inclusive, but also a policy that solves for more than one experience. And I think that in a lot of ways, someone who worked 14 years in higher ed, it turns out that I bring a lot of policy forward that impacts higher ed, that thinks about the system, that thinks about funding opportunities, retention, all of these things that were part of my everyday life for 14 years. I certainly think as someone who has worked with so many students over those 14 years, thousands of students that I've worked with over those 14 years I spent in higher ed, I think a lot about economic opportunity, about professional advancement, about degree completion. I think about jobs and salary, because those were elements that we needed to consider when we were thinking about what to prepare for, what's programs to apply, how to help students. And so I think that if you look at some of my work in terms of the professionalization, jobs, making sure that, women, childcare workers aren't left behind and they're, advanced, making sure that people know how to negotiate salaries. Like I used to give workshops on negotiate, right? Like putting together a resume, applying for a job, negotiating a salary. So I don't think that for those that have followed or understand some of my work over the last couple decades, they would be surprised that this is some of the work that I do. I think if you know that in my district, we've had oil extraction for over 155 years, you're not going to be surprised that some of the work that I do is connected to some of the impacts we've seen from 155 plus years of oil extraction, right? I think that those are all very reasonable expectations. I think that one of the things that I also see is that so many women also try to solve problems, not just that we've identified, but also problems that are identified as greater societal impacts. Like sometimes people, and there are times where I've been asked why are you running this bill? Like this isn't exactly impact you. And that's, I thought, like, when people have said that to me, I'm like, well, that's the point. Not all of what we do is about ourselves. It's about others and trying to help like our community advance and the community at large. And so it's been really kind of interesting to be in this job, but also just reflect that every day is a lived experiences. And certainly our lived experiences aren't the be all to everyone and for everyone, but they're part of how you accumulate more information and you try to understand others' experiences as you work through the policies that we do and as we shape them.
And as you've indicated, I think it's really critical to note that some of the policies that you're doing this year kind of go in line with the values that you've brought to the legislature, not only as an educator, as you had indicated, but also your movement for transparency, I think, in many respects. And so I'd love to ask you specifically, not only about your involvement with and you're pushing for 1162. But now I wanted to know specifically, in January, a New York Times article reported that a mandatory $15 an hour food safety class called Serve Safe is using worker funds to lobby against the interests of employees without their consent. SB 476 seeks to diversify training for employers and employees and compensate workers for their time. Did you have a personal connection to this, and did you ever work in the restaurant industry?
So I've definitely worked in the restaurant industry, and I think my personal connection to this is just really as someone who is watching what the challenges are in our country, in our state. So that's a little bit about that particular bill. I think our job is to think about the many issues that many different sectors face and how we try to solve them. And I think especially in the early part of any bill introduction, we start off with an idea, and I think it is very common for those ideas to be shaped by the process. And so where that bill ends up, I'm not sure, but I think certainly this is a problem that I've not identified alone. You've referenced that there's a national opinion, a national conversation about the role of restaurant workers in the context of training and lobbying of greater associations.
Absolutely. And I think I'd love to know just what you like to do in your off time as a senator, and what do you like to do maybe in terms of community service, or do you like to just spend time with family?
Do you get off time, Senator?
Do I get off time? I think we don't, as elected officials, we don't get as much off time as folks who have a, 8 to 5 job Monday through Friday. But certainly I think that it is important to regroup, to reset for all of us, right, in terms of all jobs. And so I do really enjoy spending time with the family. That's really, really key. That is kind of what re-energizes me on a lot of different levels. And so that to me is the most special part of what off time means. And like any other working parent, off time also means you have to get a lot of things done at home. I don't want it to be lost on folks that we have everyday responsibilities. We have to clean, we have to do laundry, we have to do dishes, we have to organize our bills and, kind of talk about the logistics of the week. All of that is still part of our everyday lives. Just because you're an elected official, that does not go away. And so that certainly, that's included in the off time. But assuming that all of that's done, I really do just enjoy kind of being with the family.
That's fantastic. And as a new mother, I'm sure you want to be a role model for your daughter. Are there any other women in your life that have shaped you as an elected official, as a mother, as a Latina, an educator? Are there any lessons that you hope to instill in her life?
I think that there are a lot of women who kind of influence the way that I think not just about this job, but about motherhood, about your own kind of process. And a lot of those women are really here. I feel like I've learned a lot from other women legislators who have some of the same responsibilities, who carry kind of, the torch for their family in one way or other, whether they're caring for a child or caring for, elder grandparents or elder parents or a loved one. I mean, there are so many women in the legislature who I think serve as role models to each other. They also, sometimes the term role model is like very loaded. There's this expectation that there is perfection, that there is, mastery of some sort, as much as there is, I think for me, what I see, in terms of the other women who serve in the legislature is I see a lot of learning and exchange of techniques and tools on how to do our job, how to advance the things that we care about, but also how to be present when we're home with the family, with loved ones, with, there's so many issues that we juggle. So I think that for this Women's History Month, my hat really goes off to other women legislators who I think are rocking it, who I think are doing an incredible job, but who also are part of a group of women who are still kind of learning and supporting each other.
Absolutely. Brian, if you have any other questions.
Well, this is great to have you both in dialogue, a positive imprint on our month here. And actually, I have a final thought, and not to bring a sober tone to an otherwise positive and progressively forward conversation, but you talk about articles. There was a columnist last fall, I think it was in the New York Times, who reflected on how hard it is to be a woman in America. The U.S. welcomes the employment and economic advancement of women, yet doesn't actually support them, and that we finally hit a breaking point. And she says we've lost our privacy and our ability to make a living. We live in the wealthiest economy on earth, and yet it feels like we're only growing poorer. 50 years of progress is unraveling. So keeping in context everything you ladies have talked about and the positivity that you have mixed in with it, is it getting harder to be a woman? Is it harder to be a woman in 2023? Asked the man.
I think there are some elements that are taking us back because we believe that through history, through time, through the work of so many other women, we had some rights secured. And I think that as you see some of that unravel, it's certainly shaken us up. But I also feel that as I've sat here, I've chatted with Isabella, and I'm like, I have full faith. I mean, what Isabella didn't tell you is that she's a fellow that she came up with her own bill idea. She's already taking initiative, doing the work. And so I think that women don't do it alone. There are people who came before us, people who will come after us. And I think understanding that and building off of that is why I am hopeful that not all is lost. But I also recognize that it's been a heck of a hard time these few years, watching rights advancement kind of shift in such a way that it has so many women across the globe, across the country, wondering, what progress have we really made? And I think it's fair to ask that question, while also I think it's important to not lose sight that we still every day have to work. You never can just believe that the work is done. The work is everyday work, and it doesn't just happen with the self, it happens in the collective as well.
Isabella, thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that it's been really great having a staff that's been supportive in seeing what their perspectives are as women. It's fantastic to be able to have the mentorship of a female chief of staff who is able to tell me a little bit about what her perspective has been like, not only as a chief of staff, but also as a public official on the outside too, and seeing what that looks like. I think in terms of the national conversation, I think that there's a lot that's been addressed, and I think in terms of some of the corporate conversations and even the public service conversations, I hope that we can find ways to strategize on what we can do moving forward. I feel like there's a growing coalition of a lot of young and older women who are coming together and ensuring that we still have these rights here and we can still push for these rights, specifically not only in the state, but across the nation. I think that as a woman of color, working with other women of color, we see what those setbacks look like in real time. But that nevertheless doesn't mean that we can't push forward.
Wow. You know, Isabella, you're fantastic. If you want to host a podcast,
Yeah.
I'm happy to step aside and let the
you.
next generation start doing this. No, really, you're wonderful. And
Thank
both
you
of you,
so
thank you
much.
so much. As we speak, the sun is setting here after a long, busy day here at the Capitol. And I'm so grateful to both of you for taking the time to come sit with us here and have this dialogue on Women's History Month. Isabella, thank you so much for being part of this, and good luck with your fellowship.
Thank you
and
so
for
much.
your wonderful questions and thoughtful responses, too. And Senator Limón, always good to see you. Hope we can
Always
do
good
this
to
again
see you
soon.
too, Brian.
Have a great legislative year, and hopefully
Thank
we'll
you.
see you sooner than later on whatever issues are out there, and I know there's many, and we're glad to have you here again on Then There's California. Senator Monique Limón of Santa Barbara, the chair of the Senate Democratic Caucus, and Isabella Martinez from Hemet, California, a 2023 Senate fellow working for Senator Limón. And that brings us to a close of this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus, with technical assistance and production support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulty, John Roman, Ann DeGrazia, Michelle Baker, McLeana Woods, and the graphic artistry of Tim Davis. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.